The rain hammered against the tall windows of the Montgomery estate, creating rivers that streaked down the glass like tears. Inside the servants' quarters, Maria clutched her phone with trembling hands, reading the text message for the 5th time. Her younger sister's words blurred through her tears. "Mama's fever is very high. She keeps coughing blood. Please come home. I'm scared." Maria pressed her palm against her mouth to muffle the sob that threatened to escape. She couldn't break down now, not when Mrs., the head housekeeper, was making her rounds. The older woman had eyes like a hawk and a heart that seemed carved from the same marble that decorated the mansion's grand entrance. Any sign of weakness, any hint that Maria's personal problems might interfere with her work, and she would be dismissed without a second thought. The 23-year-old Maid had been working at the Montgomery estate for nearly 2 years, ever since her father had passed away from a heart attack, leaving behind a mountain of hospital debts. Her mother, who had worked as a seamstress her entire life, had tried to keep the family afloat, but the strain had destroyed her health. Now her mother lay in their tiny apartment across the city, probably burning with fever, while Maria scrubbed floors and polished silverware in a house that cost more than she could earn in 10 lifetimes. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. Her shift had officially ended 2 hours ago, but Mrs. had assigned her extra duties because one of the other maids had called in sick. Maria had spent the evening cleaning the library, a massive room filled with leather-bound books that nobody ever read and furniture that probably cost more than her family's annual income. Her phone buzzed again, another message from her sister. "She's asking for you. I gave her the medicine you left, but it's not helping. What should I do?" Maria's heart clenched. The medicine she had left was just basic fever reducers from the pharmacy, purchased with the last of her previous week's salary. Her mother needed real treatment, needed to see a doctor, needed prescription medication that Maria couldn't afford. The free clinic in their neighborhood had closed down 6 months ago, and the nearest hospital would demand payment up front before they would even look at her mother. She typed back quickly, "Keep her comfortable, put a wet cloth on her forehead, I'll try to come home soon." But even as she sent the message, Maria knew it was a lie. She couldn't leave now, not in the middle of the night, not without permission, and Mrs. would never give her permission for a family emergency. The head housekeeper had made it clear during Maria's first week that personal problems were to be left at the gate. "You are here to work," Mrs. had said, her voice as cold as winter steel. "Your family, your troubles, your feelings, they do not exist when you wear this uniform." Maria tucked her phone into her apron pocket and looked at her reflection in the small mirror above her narrow bed. She barely recognized herself anymore. The bright-eyed girl who had once dreamed of becoming a teacher seemed like a distant memory. Now she saw only exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes, and the permanent worry line between her brows that made her look older than her years. A sharp knock at her door made her jump. "Maria," Mrs.'s voice cut through the wooden door like a blade. "Why are you not in bed? Tomorrow we have the gallery opening preparation. You need to be ready at 5 in the morning." Maria quickly wiped her eyes and opened the door. Mrs. stood in the hallway, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her uniform impeccable even at this late hour. The woman never seemed to sleep, never seemed to relax, never seemed to be anything other than a soldier guarding the Montgomery fortress. "I'm sorry, Mrs.," Maria said, keeping her eyes downcast. "I was just about to sleep." The older woman's sharp gaze swept over Maria's face, and for a brief moment, something that might have been concern flickered in her eyes. But it vanished so quickly that Maria wondered if she had imagined it. "You look terrible," Mrs. said bluntly. "Are you ill?" "No, ma'am, just tired." "Then sleep. Mr. Montgomery is hosting important guests tomorrow evening. Everything must be perfect. I cannot have you making mistakes because you are exhausted." Maria nodded and started to close the door, but Mrs. Hand stopped it. "And Maria," she added, her voice slightly softer, "whatever is troubling you, leave it outside these walls. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." After Mrs. left, Maria sat on her bed and pulled out her phone again. She opened her banking app, though she already knew what she would find. Her account showed exactly $43.16. Her next paycheck wasn't for another 10 days. The money she had sent to her sister last week had left her nearly broke. She switched to her messages and scrolled through the conversation with her sister. The progression of their mother's illness was documented in these texts. 3 weeks ago, it had been just a slight cough. 2 weeks ago, her mother had complained of chest pain. Last week, the fever had started. And now, blood. Maria knew what that meant. Her mother probably had pneumonia, possibly worse. Without proper treatment, without antibiotics, without hospitalization, the infection would only get worse. People died from pneumonia. People died when they couldn't afford medicine. People died every day because of money or the lack of it. She thought about the medicine cabinet in the Montgomery mansion's many bathrooms. She had seen bottles of prescription medications while cleaning, pills that probably cost hundreds of dollars, sitting unused in marble cabinets. She thought about the money that flowed through this house like water, the casual way Mrs. Montgomery would buy a new dress that cost thousands of dollars just because she liked the color. But stealing was out of the question. Maria's mother had raised her to be honest, to work hard, to never take what didn't belong to her. Even in their darkest moments, even when her father was dying and the bills were piling up, her mother had refused charity, had refused to compromise her principles. "We may be poor," her mother had said, "but we are not thieves, we are not beggars, we work with our hands and we hold our heads high." Maria lay back on her narrow bed, still in her uniform, and stared at the ceiling. The room was small, barely larger than a closet, with space only for a bed, a small dresser, and a tiny bathroom. But it was clean and warm, which was more than she could say for the apartment she shared with her mother and sister. At least here she had regular meals, even if she had to eat them quickly in the kitchen between tasks. At least here she had a roof that didn't leak and heat that worked. But what good was any of it if her mother died, while she was polishing someone else's silver? She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, her phone was buzzing insistently. She grabbed it, her heart pounding. It was her sister calling. Maria whispered, glancing at the clock. It was 2 a.m. "Maria, you need to come home." Her sister's voice was high and panicked. "Mama's not waking up. I shake her and she doesn't open her eyes. I'm so scared. I don't know what to do." Maria sat up, her pulse racing. "Did you call an ambulance?" "They want money up front. They said without insurance they need payment before they come. Maria, I don't have any money. What do I do?" Maria's mind raced. She thought of the $43 in her account. She thought of the locked door between her and the outside world. She thought of Mrs. Swarning. She thought of her job, her only source of income, the thing that kept her family from complete destitution. And then she thought of her mother, unconscious, possibly dying, while her teenage sister sat helpless and terrified beside her. "I'm coming," Maria said, standing up. "I'm leaving right now. Call our neighbor, Mrs. Park. Tell her what's happening. She'll help until I get there." "But Maria, it's the middle of the night. Won't you get in trouble?" "I don't care. I'm coming." She hung up and quickly changed out of her uniform into her regular clothes, a faded pair of jeans and an old sweater. She grabbed her jacket and her purse, checking to make sure she had her keys and her ID. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely zip her jacket. The servants' quarters had a side door that led to the garden. Maria knew it would be locked, but she also knew where Mrs. kept the spare keys. It was a terrible risk. If she was caught, she would be fired immediately, possibly even accused of theft or worse. But her mother was unconscious. Nothing else mattered. She crept down the hallway, her shoes in her hand so she wouldn't make noise. The mansion was dark and silent, lit only by the dim emergency lights along the baseboards. She could hear her own breathing, loud in her ears, and the distant sound of the rain still falling outside. Mrs. Office was on the first floor of the servants' wing. Maria had cleaned it countless times and knew exactly where everything was kept. The door was unlocked. Mrs. never bothered to lock it because she trusted that none of the servants would dare enter without permission. Maria slipped inside, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She went straight to the small desk and opened the top drawer. Inside was a ring of keys, each one labeled with a tag. She found the one marked garden door and took it, her fingers fumbling. Just as she closed the drawer, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Maria froze, her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps were slow, measured, coming closer. She looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the office was small and spare, with nowhere to conceal herself. If someone came in and found her here with Mrs. keys in her hand, there would be no explanation, no excuse. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Maria pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure whoever was outside could hear it. She clutched the key ring so tightly that the metal bit into her palm. The door handle began to turn. Maria closed her eyes, preparing for discovery, for accusations, for the end of everything. But then a phone rang somewhere down the hall and the footsteps moved away, hurrying toward the sound. She heard Mrs.'s voice, irritated and sleepy. "This better be important." Maria didn't wait another second. She slipped out of the office and ran toward the garden door, her shoes still in her hand, moving as quickly and quietly as she could. The key slid into the lock and she turned it, wincing at the loud click it made in the silence. The garden was dark and wet, the rain still falling in a steady drizzle. Maria didn't care. She ran across the grass, soaking her socks, heading for the side gate that led to the street. This gate had a code which she had seen Mrs. enter countless times. She punched in the numbers, praying she had remembered correctly. The gate buzzed and clicked open. Maria ran through it and kept running, not looking back, her shoes still in her hand, her feet splashing through puddles. She needed to get to the main road to catch a taxi. At this hour, in this rain, in this wealthy neighborhood where nobody walked, she knew she looked suspicious, but she didn't care. She finally stopped at a major intersection, gasping for breath, and tried to flag down a taxi. 3 passed without stopping before one finally pulled over. The driver looked skeptical when he saw her, soaking wet, no shoes on, clearly distressed. "Please," Maria said, climbing into the back seat. "Please take me to Riverside District. I'll pay, I promise." She gave him her address and he pulled away from the curb. Maria watched the Montgomery estate disappear in the distance, and with it probably her job, her income, her family's fragile stability. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting to her mother. The drive across the city took 40 minutes. Maria watched the neighborhoods change from wealthy and pristine to working class to poor. The buildings got shorter, the streets got narrower, the paint got more faded. By the time they reached her apartment building, the meter showed $38. Maria handed the driver all the cash from her wallet, $43, and told him to keep the change. He looked at her with something like pity as she climbed out. The apartment building was 5 stories of crumbling brick and broken dreams. Maria ran up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time until she reached the 3rd floor. The door to her apartment was slightly ajar, and she could hear voices inside. She pushed through and found her sister sitting on the floor beside the couch where their mother lay. Mrs. Park, their elderly neighbor, was pressing a wet cloth to their mother's forehead. Several other neighbors were there too, people from their floor who had heard the commotion and come to help. Maria dropped to her knees beside the couch. Her mother's face was gray, her breathing shallow and labored. The wet cloth couldn't hide the heat radiating from her skin. "Mama," Maria whispered, taking her mother's hand. "Mama, I'm here." Her mother's eyes fluttered but didn't open. Her lips were cracked and dry, and there was a rattling sound in her chest with each breath. "We need to get her to a hospital," Mrs. Park said quietly. "She needs more help than we can give her here." "I don't have money," Maria said, her voice breaking. "I don't have insurance, they won't take her." Mrs. Park squeezed her shoulder. "There's a hospital on the east side. It's far, but they have a charity program. They might help, but we need to move fast." Maria looked at her phone. It was almost 3 in the morning. She had no car, no money, no way to transport her mother except to call another ambulance that would demand payment she couldn't provide. "I'll call them," she said, pulling up her phone. "I'll beg them, I'll promise to pay, I'll do anything." She dialed the emergency number, her hands shaking, and explained the situation. The operator was sympathetic but firm. They needed a credit card number or a payment guarantee before they could dispatch an ambulance to this part of the city. Maria was still pleading with the operator when she heard it, the sound of a car pulling up outside. A car door closed, then another. Footsteps on the stairs, multiple sets of them moving quickly. Everyone in the apartment tensed. At this hour, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. Police, maybe, or gang members, or landlords coming to evict someone. Maria's building had seen all of these things and worse. The footsteps stopped outside their door. Then came a knock, firm and authoritative. Maria stood up slowly, her heart in her throat. Through the door's small window, she could see a man in an expensive suit, rain-soaked but still immaculate. Behind him stood 2 other men, built like bodyguards, wearing dark clothes despite the late hour. "Who is it?" Maria called out, her voice wavering. "My name is Alexander Montgomery," the man said, his voice deep and cultured. "I'm looking for Maria Santos. I believe she works for my family." The apartment went silent. Everyone stared at Maria. Mrs. Park's eyes were wide with concern, grabbed Maria's hand, frightened. Maria felt her legs go weak. The owner of the Montgomery estate, one of the wealthiest men in the city, was standing outside her door at 3 in the morning. She had run away from his house, stolen his keys, abandoned her post, and somehow, impossibly, he had found her. She was finished. She was going to be arrested. Her family was going to lose everything. But her mother was dying on the couch behind her, and somehow even fear and shame couldn't compare to that desperate fact. Alexander Montgomery stood in the doorway, water dripping from his dark hair onto the collar of his shirt. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Maria had seen him before, of course, during her 2 years working at the estate, but always from a distance. The servants were trained to make themselves invisible when family members were present, to fade into the background like living furniture. Now standing face to face with him in the cramped doorway of her tiny apartment, Maria realized she had never truly looked at him before. There was something in his expression that surprised her, not anger, not the cold fury she had expected, but something else. Concern, maybe, or curiosity. "Miss Santos," he said quietly, his eyes moving past her to the scene inside the apartment. "May I come in?" Maria stepped back automatically, years of servant training overriding her confusion. Alexander entered, followed by his 2 companions. The small apartment seemed to shrink even further with their presence. These men belonged in marble halls and private jets, not in a cramped space that smelled of old cooking oil and mildew. Alexander's gaze went immediately to the couch where Maria's mother lay. He moved toward her without hesitation, kneeling beside the couch with a grace that seemed out of place in the shabby surroundings. He touched the back of his hand to her forehead, then checked her pulse at her wrist. The gesture was practiced, professional. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, looking up at Maria. Maria's voice came out as a whisper. "My sister called me at 2. She said our mother wouldn't wake up, but she's been sick for weeks. It started as a cough, then fever, and tonight." She couldn't finish the sentence. Alexander stood and pulled out his phone. "James," he said into it, his voice commanding, "I need an ambulance at this address immediately. Elderly female patient, unconscious, likely severe pneumonia or respiratory infection. Yes, I'll cover all costs. I don't care what it takes. I need the best paramedics in the city here in 10 minutes. He ended the call and looked at Maria. "They're coming, my private medical team. They'll transport her to hospital. It's the best in the state." Maria felt the room spin. "I can't afford," she said. "I can barely afford the free clinic. I don't have insurance I don't have." "I'm covering it," Alexander said simply. "All of it. That's not something you need to worry about right now." "But why?" The question burst out of Maria before she could stop it. "Why are you here? How did you even find me?" Alexander's expression shifted, and for a moment he looked almost uncomfortable. "Mrs. called me an hour ago. She does a bed check at 2 a.m. every night. Did you know that? She found your room empty, found her office keys missing. She was about to call the police when I stopped her." "I'm sorry," Maria said, tears streaming down her face now. "I'm so sorry. I know I broke the rules. I know I'll be fired. But my mother was dying, and I couldn't just stay there and polish silver while she—" Her voice broke. "Stop apologizing," Alexander said, and there was something fierce in his voice. "You had a family emergency. You did what you had to do. Mrs. gave me your employee file, which had this address. I came to find you to make sure you were safe and to help if I could." One of his companions, a burly man with a kind face, stepped forward. "Mr. Montgomery," he said quietly, "the ambulance is 3 minutes out." Alexander nodded, then turned back to Maria. "Is there anything your mother needs right now? Any medication she's been taking?" Maria shook her head helplessly. "Just fever medicine from the pharmacy. That's all I could afford. She needs antibiotics, she needs proper care, but I can't." She stopped herself. She had already said it. She couldn't afford any of it. Who had been silent and wide-eyed through all of this, suddenly spoke up. "Are you really going to help Mama?" she asked, her voice small. "You're not just saying that." Alexander looked at the teenage girl and his expression softened. "I promise," he said. "Your mother is going to get the best care available. I give you my word." Mrs. Park, who had been watching all of this with a mixture of suspicion and hope, cleared her throat. "Who are you, really?" she asked Alexander. "Why would a rich man come here in the middle of the night to help people he doesn't know?" It was a good question, Maria thought. It was the question she should have been asking herself. Nothing about this made sense. Wealthy people didn't personally track down runaway servants. They didn't offer to pay hospital bills for their employees' family members. They didn't kneel beside sick women in poor apartments and promise to help. Alexander met Mrs. Park's gaze steadily. "I'm someone who recognizes an emergency when he sees one," he said. "And I'm someone who believes that when you have the power to help, you have the responsibility to do so." The sound of sirens cut through the night. Within moments, paramedics were climbing the stairs, carrying equipment, moving with the efficiency of a well-trained team. They weren't the usual city ambulance crew that Maria had expected. These were private medical professionals, wearing uniforms that looked more like they belonged in a hospital than on the street. They assessed Maria's mother quickly, inserting an IV, placing an oxygen mask over her face, checking her vital signs. Their leader, a woman with gray hair and steady hands, looked up at Alexander. "Severe pneumonia, possibly bacterial," she said. "Blood oxygen is dangerously low. We need to move her now." They transferred Maria's mother to a stretcher with practiced care, securing her, adjusting the IV, monitoring her constantly. The small apartment became a controlled chaos of movement and medical terminology. Maria watched, feeling helpless, as these strangers prepared to take her mother away. "Can I come with her?" Maria asked the lead paramedic. "Family can ride in the ambulance," the woman confirmed. "Both of you should go," Alexander said, looking at Maria, "and stay with your mother. I'll follow in my car." Maria hesitated. Nothing about this felt real. An hour ago, she had been stealing keys and running through the rain. Now a billionaire was arranging medical care and offering to follow them to the hospital. It was like stepping through a mirror into a different world. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, needing to understand. Alexander was silent for a moment, and something complicated passed across his face. "Let's get your mother to the hospital first," he said. "Then we can talk." The paramedics were already moving toward the door with the stretcher. Maria and grabbed their jackets and followed. As they descended the stairs, Maria looked back to see Mrs. Park and the other neighbors standing in the doorway, watching with expressions of amazement. Their world rarely included miracles. Tonight felt like witnessing one. The ambulance ride was a blur. Maria held her mother's hand while the paramedics worked, calling out numbers and terms she didn't understand. Sat pressed against her side, silent and pale. The oxygen mask covered their mother's face, but Maria could see her chest rising and falling, could hear the labored rasp of each breath. "Is she going to be okay?" Maria whispered to the lead paramedic. The woman's expression was carefully neutral. "She's very sick," she said honestly. "But we're doing everything we can and has one of the best intensive care units in the country. She has a fighting chance." A fighting chance. A month ago, Maria's mother hadn't even had that. Without money, without insurance, without access to proper care, she would have simply died in that apartment, another casualty of poverty that nobody would notice or mourn except her daughters. The ambulance pulled up to hospital, a gleaming building of glass and steel that Maria had only seen from the outside. She had never imagined entering through its doors, let alone in an emergency. This was where wealthy people came for their surgeries and their treatments, where politicians and celebrities received their care. It wasn't a place for people like her. But the paramedics were already pulling the stretcher out, and a team of doctors and nurses were waiting at the entrance. They moved her mother inside with swift precision, calling out information to each other, disappearing through a set of double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Maria and stood in the lobby, suddenly alone, watching their mother vanish from sight. The hospital lobby was pristine and quiet, lit with soft lighting decorated with expensive art. It even smelled different from the public hospitals Maria had been to with her father, less like antiseptic and desperation, more like money and privilege. A woman in professional clothes approached them with a clipboard. "Are you family of the patient?" she asked. "I'm her daughter," Maria said. "This is her younger daughter. I need to get some information for our records. Insurance information, payment methods." "That won't be necessary." Alexander's voice came from behind them. Maria turned to see him striding through the lobby, his presence somehow commanding attention even in this place of quiet efficiency. The woman with the clipboard recognized him immediately, and her entire demeanor changed. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice becoming deferential. "I didn't realize you were involved with this case." "I'm covering all expenses," he said firmly. "Ms. Santos and her family are under my personal care. They are not to be bothered with any billing or financial questions. Direct all invoices to my office." Is that clear? Perfectly clear, sir. I'll make a note in the file immediately. The woman hurried away, and Alexander turned to Maria and, "Come with me," he said. "There's a private waiting room on the second floor where you'll be more comfortable." Maria wanted to argue, wanted to say that they couldn't accept this much help, that it was too much, that they didn't deserve it. But she was exhausted, emotionally drained, and her sister was leaning against her with tears streaming down her young face. So she just nodded and followed Alexander to the elevator. The private waiting room was nothing like the crowded, uncomfortable spaces Maria had experienced in public hospitals. It had comfortable couches, a coffee machine, soft lighting, and large windows overlooking the city. It was 4 in the morning now, and the sky was beginning to show the first hints of dawn. Alexander gestured for them to sit. "The doctors will come talk to you as soon as they have information," he said. "It might be a while. They're running tests, starting treatment. These things take time." Immediately curled up on one of the couches, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the night. Maria sat beside her, but she couldn't relax. She looked at Alexander, who was standing by the window, his profile sharp against the growing light outside. "You haven't answered my question," she said quietly. "Why are you doing all of this?" Alexander was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to face her, and his expression was serious. "3 years ago," he said, "my sister died from complications due to a rare autoimmune disease. She was 28 years old. She had access to the best doctors in the world, the best treatments, experimental therapies that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. We tried everything, and she still died." His voice was steady, but Maria could hear the pain underneath it. "After she died," he continued, "I couldn't stop thinking about all the people who were dying from treatable conditions. People who died not because medicine couldn't help them, but because they couldn't afford the help. It seemed so wrong. It is wrong. I started a foundation in my sister's name. We fund medical care for people who can't afford it, but that's all administrative, all distant. Checks written, forms filled out." He paused, looking directly at Maria. "Tonight, Mrs. called me about a maid who had abandoned her post. She was angry, wanted me to authorize filing charges. And I thought about you running out into the night, desperate and afraid, and I realized you were probably facing exactly the kind of emergency that the foundation was meant to help with. So I came, not as the owner of the estate, but as someone who has the resources to help and the memory of someone he couldn't save." Maria felt tears on her cheeks again. She wiped them away quickly. "Your sister," she said. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Alexander sat down in one of the chairs across from her. "Tell me about your mother." And so Maria did. She told him about her mother's life as a seamstress, about her father's death and the debts it left behind, about working at the Montgomery estate to support her family, about watching her mother get sicker and being unable to afford the medicine that could help. She told him about the fear, the helplessness, the guilt of sleeping in a warm bed in the servants' quarters while her mother struggled in a cold apartment. Alexander listened without interrupting, his attention completely focused on her words. It was strange, Maria thought, to be truly seen by someone like him. For 2 years she had been invisible in his house, just another maid in a uniform, forgettable and interchangeable. Now he was listening to her story as if it mattered. "You've been carrying all of this alone," he said when she finished. "For 2 years, why didn't you ask for help? The estate has an employee assistance program." Maria laughed bitterly. "Mr. Montgomery, with respect, the employee assistance program is a joke. It offers counseling and budgeting advice. It doesn't offer to pay for pneumonia treatment or prescription antibiotics or hospital bills. And besides, Mrs. made it very clear that personal problems were not to interfere with work. Asking for help would have been seen as weakness." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Mrs. said that?" "Not in those exact words, but the message was clear." He pulled out his phone and typed something quickly. "That's going to change," he said. "Starting tomorrow, starting today, actually." Before Maria could respond, a doctor entered the waiting room. He was an older man with kind eyes and the air of someone who had seen everything and was no longer easily rattled. "Ms. Santos," he said, looking at Maria. She stood quickly. "Yes, how is my mother?" "Your mother is stable," the doctor said, and Maria felt her knees go weak with relief. "She has severe bacterial pneumonia which had progressed to the point of causing sepsis. That's why she lost consciousness. Her body was shutting down from the infection." "But she's going to be okay?" Maria asked, her voice breaking on the last word. She's going to need intensive treatment, the doctor said carefully. We've started her on broad-spectrum antibiotics and fluids. Her oxygen levels are improving, but I won't lie to you, she's very sick. If she had gone even a few more hours without treatment, we might not have been able to save her. You got her here just in time. Just in time, because Alexander Montgomery had shown up at her door, because he had made a phone call, because he had resources that Maria could never dream of having. Can I see her? Maria asked. She's in the intensive care unit. She's sedated right now to let her body rest and heal. You can see her, but she won't be able to talk to you. Visiting hours in the ICU are restricted, but given the circumstances. The doctor glanced at Alexander. I think we can make an exception. The ICU was a quiet place, filled with the sounds of medical equipment beeping and humming. Maria's mother looked small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and monitors. But her face, which had been so gray and lifeless in the apartment, had a bit more color now. The oxygen mask covered her nose and mouth, and her chest rose and fell with more steady rhythm. Maria took her mother's hand carefully, mindful of the IV line. Mama, she whispered, I'm here, you're going to be okay, you're in the best hospital with the best doctors, you're going to get better. Her mother didn't respond, lost in medicated sleep, but Maria thought she saw her fingers twitch slightly, as if some part of her registered her daughter's presence. Maria stayed there for a long time, holding her mother's hand, watching the monitors, listening to the steady beep of the heart rate display. Life continuing, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, because someone had cared enough to help. When she finally emerged from the ICU, dawn had fully broken. The hospital corridors were filling with the morning shift, doctors making rounds, nurses changing over, the business of healing beginning a new day. Alexander was still in the waiting room, though he had been joined by one of his assistants who was showing him something on a laptop. Was asleep on the couch, someone having covered her with a blanket. When Maria entered, Alexander looked up and closed the laptop. How is she? He asked. Sleeping but stable. The doctor says she got here just in time. Maria sat down heavily in one of the chairs. The exhaustion of the night was catching up with her, making her whole body feel heavy. I don't know how to thank you. I don't even know where to start. You don't need to thank me, Alexander said. Just focus on your mother's recovery. But I do need to thank you, and I need to apologize for leaving the estate, for taking the keys, for... Maria, he held up a hand, stopping her. You had a family emergency. Any reasonable employer would understand that. The fact that you felt you couldn't come to anyone for help, that you felt you had to run away in the middle of the night, that's a failure on our part, not yours. Mrs. is going to fire me, Maria said, the reality of the situation starting to sink in through her exhaustion. I'll lose my job, I'll lose the income, and with my mother's medical bills. Even if Alexander was covering the hospital, there would be rehabilitation, follow-up care, medications. The costs would be endless. You're not fired, Alexander said firmly. You're on paid family medical leave effective immediately for as long as you need it. And when you come back, if you come back, things are going to be different. I'm making changes to how we treat our staff, starting with Mrs. Maria looked at him in confusion. What do you mean, if I come back? Alexander stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city waking up below. I'm offering you a choice, he said. You can return to your job as a maid with significantly better working conditions and the knowledge that if you ever have a personal emergency again, you will be supported rather than punished. Or, Maria asked, because it was clear there was an alternative. He turned to face her. Or you can come work for my foundation, the one I told you about in my sister's name. We need someone who understands what it's like to need help, someone who knows how the system fails people, someone who can make sure we're actually helping the people who need it most, not just writing checks and feeling good about ourselves. Maria stared at him. You're offering me a job at your foundation. I'm offering you a purpose, Alexander corrected. If you want it, the pay would be better than what you're making now, the hours would be regular, and you'd be helping people like your mother, people who fall through the cracks. I don't have any experience with that kind of work, Maria said. I'm just a maid, I clean houses. You're a woman who took care of her family despite impossible circumstances, Alexander said. You're someone who kept working even when you were exhausted and scared, who sent money home even when you barely had enough for yourself. That's the kind of experience I need, the kind of dedication I need. Maria's mind was spinning. An hour ago, she had thought her life was over. Now she was being offered a chance at something new, something that might actually make a difference. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course, take all the time you need. Focus on your mother first. The offer stands whenever you're ready." They sat in silence for a moment, watching sleep, listening to the distant sounds of the hospital. Maria thought about all the nights she had spent scrubbing floors and polishing silver, invisible and exhausted. She thought about her mother fighting for her life in a hospital bed because she couldn't afford basic medicine. She thought about all the other people out there, struggling in silence, dying in silence, because they didn't have the right connections or enough money or just plain luck. And she thought about Alexander Montgomery, who had driven across the city in the middle of the night to help a servant he barely knew, because he remembered someone he couldn't save and was determined to save others if he could. "Can I ask you something?" Maria said quietly. "Of course." "Why me? There are thousands of employees, dozens of maids. Why track me down personally? Why not just let Mrs. handle it?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly," he said finally, "I don't know, something about Mrs. Call, the way she was so angry about you leaving, so ready to punish you, it bothered me. And I thought about what kind of emergency would make someone risk their job like that, so I came, and I'm glad I did." He looked at her directly. "But also, if I'm being completely honest, it's been a long time since I personally dealt with the people my money is supposed to help. I've been managing everything from behind a desk, making decisions based on reports and statistics. Coming here tonight, seeing your apartment, meeting your family, watching your mother fight for her life, it reminded me why I started the foundation in the first place. So maybe you helped me as much as I helped you." Maria didn't know what to say to that. The idea that she could have helped someone like Alexander Montgomery seemed absurd, but she could see the sincerity in his face, could hear the truth in his voice. "Thank you," she said simply, "for coming, for caring, for everything." "You're welcome," he replied. "Now you should rest. There's a sleeping room down the hall that family members can use. Go sleep for a few hours. I'll stay here with your sister. If anything changes with your mother, I'll wake you immediately." "You don't have to do that." "I know, but I'm going to anyway." Maria was too exhausted to argue. She woke gently and led her to the sleeping room where they both collapsed onto the beds. Within minutes was asleep again, her young face relaxed in sleep, the terror of the night temporarily erased. Maria lay awake a little longer, her mind still racing despite her body's exhaustion. She thought about the future that had suddenly opened up before her, full of possibilities she had never imagined. She thought about her mother, alive and fighting, getting the care she needed. She thought about a billionaire sitting in a hospital waiting room at dawn, keeping watch over a sleeping teenager he had never met before, because it was the right thing to do. Nothing about this night made sense according to the rules of the world Maria had always known. In her world, the rich didn't care about the poor. Employers didn't track down desperate employees to help them. Miracles didn't happen to people like her. But maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about the world. Or maybe, at least, there were some people in it who were trying to make it better. As Maria finally drifted off to sleep, her last thought was a simple one: hope. For the first time in years, she felt it blooming in her chest like a flower pushing through concrete. Her mother was alive. Her family was safe. And tomorrow, or later today, technically, she would wake up to a world that had possibilities in it again. Outside the sleeping room, Alexander Montgomery sat in the waiting room, his laptop open but largely ignored. He was thinking about his sister, about the foundation he had created in her memory, about a young woman who had run through the rain to save her mother. He was thinking about the system that forced people to make choices like that, about the resources he had, and the responsibility that came with them. His phone buzzed with messages from his office, from Mrs., from various business contacts. He ignored them all. Right now, in this moment, this was where he needed to be. Not in a boardroom or at a gallery opening or managing his empire from behind a desk. Here, in a hospital waiting room, keeping a promise to a woman who had every reason not to trust promises from people like him. The sun continued to rise over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day was beginning. Maria woke to the sound of voices outside the sleeping room. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was or why she wasn't in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters. Then it all came flooding back. The desperate phone call, the rain-soaked run through the city, Alexander Montgomery appearing at her door like something out of a dream, her mother in the ICU fighting for her life. She sat up quickly, her heart racing. was still asleep in the other bed, curled up with the blanket pulled over her head. The clock on the wall showed it was almost 11 in the morning. Maria had slept for nearly 5 hours, which was more rest than she usually got even on her days off. She stood and smoothed down her clothes, realizing she was still wearing the same jeans and sweater she had thrown on in the middle of the night. She probably looked terrible, felt terrible, but none of that mattered. She needed to check on her mother. When she opened the door, she found Alexander still in the waiting room, though he had been joined by a woman in her 50s wearing an elegant business suit. They were looking at something on a tablet, speaking in low voices. When they saw Maria, they both stood. "Maria," Alexander said, "how are you feeling?" "I'm okay. How's my mother? Has there been any news?" "The doctor came by about an hour ago. Your mother's condition has stabilized further. The antibiotics are working. She's still sedated, but her vital signs are improving steadily." Maria felt relief wash over her. "Can I see her?" "Of course, but first I'd like you to meet someone. She runs my foundation." The woman stepped forward with a warm smile and extended her hand. "It's wonderful to meet you, Maria. Alexander has told me a great deal about you." Maria shook her hand, feeling self-conscious. She couldn't imagine what Alexander would have said about her. That she was a maid who had stolen keys and run away in the middle of the night. That she was a charity case he had taken pity on. "I know this is an overwhelming time," continued, "but I wanted to introduce myself because I think you and I are going to be working together quite a bit in the future." "If I decide to take the job," Maria said, glancing at Alexander, "I haven't made up my mind yet." Of course, I don't mean to pressure you. I just wanted you to know that we would be thrilled to have you. What you've been through, what your family has experienced, that's exactly the perspective we need. We can't help people if we don't truly understand their struggles." A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Santos, your mother is awake. She's asking for you." Maria didn't wait for anything else. She followed the nurse down the corridor to the ICU, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. The last time she had seen her mother conscious, she had been weak and feverish. What if the illness had changed her? What if she was confused or in pain or... But when she entered the room, her mother's eyes were clear and focused. The oxygen mask had been replaced with a simple nasal cannula, and though she still looked pale and weak, there was life in her face again. Recognition. Love. "Maria," her mother whispered, her voice rough from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier. "My daughter." Maria rushed to her bedside, taking her hand carefully. "Mama, I'm here. You're in the hospital. You're going to be okay." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was dying. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything was so dark, and then I heard your voice telling me to hold on." "You did hold on. You fought so hard, Mama." Is she safe?" "She's here. She's sleeping in another room. She was so scared, but she was so brave. She called me. She got the neighbors to help. She didn't fall apart." Her mother smiled weakly. "She's growing up. Both of you are so strong." She paused, looking around the room with confusion. "But Maria, this hospital. This place is so expensive. How are we here? The last thing I remember said the ambulance wouldn't come without payment." Maria hesitated, unsure how to explain everything that had happened. "Someone helped us," she said finally. "Someone with resources. They're paying for your treatment." Who would do that for us?" Before Maria could answer, there was a soft knock on the door. Alexander stood there, looking uncertain in a way that seemed strange on someone who usually projected such confidence. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. "I just wanted to check in, make sure everything was okay." Maria's mother stared at him with wide eyes. "You're the man from the television," she said. "The Montgomery son, the one who runs all those companies." "That's me," Alexander confirmed, stepping into the room. "And you must be Mrs. Santos. It's good to see you awake. You gave everyone quite a scare." "You helped my daughter. You brought me here." "I did, and I'm very glad we got you here in time." Maria's mother tried to sit up, but the effort made her cough. Maria and a nurse who had followed Alexander into the room both moved to help her, adjusting the bed so she could be more upright. "Why?" Maria's mother asked when she could breathe again. "Why would someone like you help people like us? What do you want in return?" It was a blunt question, but Maria understood it. In their world, nothing came for free. People didn't help unless they wanted something. Charity always had strings attached. Kindness was usually a mask for some hidden agenda. Alexander didn't seem offended by the question. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat down, making himself level with Maria's mother rather than towering over her hospital bed. "I don't want anything in return," he said simply. "I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. What I want, what I need, is to do something meaningful with it. My sister died 3 years ago despite having access to the best medical care in the world. After she died, I started thinking about all the people who die not because medicine can't help them, but because they can't afford the help. It seemed profoundly wrong to me. So I started a foundation to help people who fall through the cracks in our healthcare system." He paused, looking at Maria. "Your daughter works for my family. When she left in the middle of the night to come to you, it brought the issue right to my doorstep. I realized I had been managing everything from a distance, writing checks and signing off on programs. But I hadn't been seeing the actual people, the actual struggles. So I came. And I'm glad I did, because now you're getting the treatment you need." Maria's mother was quiet for a long moment, studying Alexander's face as if trying to read the truth in it. Finally, she spoke. "You're really not going to present us with a bill, not going to make Maria work off the debt somehow?" "No, ma'am. The only thing I'm going to do is ask your daughter to consider coming to work for my foundation, helping us do a better job of helping people like you. But that's her choice, and it has nothing to do with your medical care. That's covered regardless of what she decides." Tears rolled down Maria's mother's face. "I don't understand this world," she whispered. "I don't understand why good things would happen to us. We're nobody. We're nothing." "You're not nothing," Alexander said firmly. "You raised 2 remarkable daughters while working your fingers to the bone. You're a fighter who survived an illness that should have killed you. You're someone who matters to the people who love you. That's not nothing. That's everything." Maria felt her own tears starting again. She had spent so long feeling invisible, feeling like she and her family didn't matter to anyone outside their small circle of neighbors and friends. Hearing someone like Alexander Montgomery say they mattered felt almost impossible to believe. A doctor entered the room, breaking the emotional moment. "Mrs. Santos, I'm Doctor, no relation to the Mrs. at the Montgomery estate," he added with a small smile. "I'm one of the here. I've been overseeing your care." "Am I going to be okay, doctor?" Maria's mother asked, her voice trembling. "You're going to recover," doctor said confidently. "The pneumonia was severe and the sepsis was life-threatening, but you're responding well to treatment. You'll need to stay here for at least a week, maybe 2. After that, you'll need rest and rehabilitation at home. But yes, you're going to be okay." The relief on her mother's face was profound. Maria squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of the last few weeks finally lifting from her shoulders. Her mother was going to live. They were going to be okay. After the doctor left, a nurse came in to check vitals and adjust medications. Alexander stood to leave, but Maria's mother stopped him. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, "I can't repay you for what you've done. I don't have the words to thank you properly. But I want you to know that I will remember this kindness for the rest of my life, and I will teach my about it when I have them. I will make sure they know that sometimes, when everything seems darkest, good people still exist in this world." Alexander looked genuinely moved. "That means more to me than you know," he said quietly. "Just focus on getting better. That's all the thanks I need." As he left the room, Maria followed him out into the hallway. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked. "Of course." They walked to a quiet corner of the corridor, away from the bustle of nurses and visitors. Maria took a deep breath, trying to organize the swirl of thoughts and emotions in her head. "I want to take the job," she said. "Working for your foundation. I want to help other people the way you helped us. I want to make sure what happened to my mother doesn't happen to anyone else if we can prevent it." Alexander smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and less burdened. "I was hoping you'd say that. When can you start?" "My mother will be here for a week or 2, you said. I want to be here with her during that time and help her settle back home after she's released. And my sister will need support too. She's still in school, and this has been traumatic for her. So maybe 3 weeks? A month. Take as much time as you need. Family comes first, always." "There's something else," Maria said, gathering her courage. "When I do start, I want to make sure I understand everything. I don't have a college degree. I barely finished high school before I had to start working. I know how to clean and cook and follow orders, but I don't know anything about running programs or managing budgets or whatever it is that people do at foundations." "We'll train you," his voice came from behind them. She had appeared in the corridor, tablet still in hand. I've been doing this work for 20 years. I can teach you everything you need to know. And honestly, the most important thing you can bring to this job isn't knowledge of nonprofit management, it's empathy. It's understanding. It's the ability to look at a situation and see the real person behind the paperwork. That's something I can't teach. That's something you already have. Maria looked between them, these two people who seemed to genuinely believe she could do this. What would my job actually be? She asked. What would I do every day? His eyes lit up. Right now, we process applications for medical assistance. People submit forms, we review them, we approve or deny funding. But the process is bureaucratic and confusing. Many people who need help never even apply because they don't understand the system or they don't think they qualify. Your job would be to change that. She pulled up something on her tablet and showed it to Maria. These are our application numbers over the past year. See how they're concentrated in wealthier zip codes? Not because poor areas don't need help, but because people in those areas are more likely to know about us, more likely to have internet access to find our website, more likely to be able to navigate the application process. You want me to reach the people who aren't applying, Maria said, understanding dawning. Exactly. I want you to go into the communities that need us most and make sure they know we exist. I want you to help people fill out the forms. I want you to be the bridge between the people who need help and the resources we have. And I want you to come back and tell us how we can do better, what barriers we're putting up without realizing it, how we can actually serve the people we're supposed to be serving. It sounded overwhelming and exciting and terrifying all at once. I can do that, Maria said, and was surprised to find she actually believed it. I know those communities. I live in one. I know the neighbors. I know the churches. I know the people who fall through the cracks because I've been one of them. That's exactly why you're perfect for this, Alexander said. We can hire people with fancy degrees to manage the finances and write the reports. What I need, is someone who can keep us honest. Someone who can make sure we're not just congratulating ourselves for our charity while people continue to suffer because we're making it too hard for them to get help. They talked for another hour, sitting in the waiting room, discussing details and possibilities. Maria would start with a training period, learning how the foundation worked, understanding their programs and policies. Then she would begin outreach, starting in her own neighborhood. She would be given resources to host information sessions, to help people navigate the application process, to identify gaps in their services. The salary they quoted made Maria's head spin. It was nearly 3 times what she had been making as a maid. It included health insurance for her and her family. It included paid vacation time, which Maria had never had in her life. It included support for continuing education if she wanted to take classes to develop her skills. This is too much, Maria said, feeling overwhelmed. This is more than I ever dreamed of having. It's what you deserve, said firmly. And honestly, you'll be working hard for it. This isn't a charity position. We're hearing you because we need you, because you can do something for us that nobody else can. As the afternoon wore on, woke up and joined them. She was quiet and subdued, the trauma of the previous night still evident in her face. But when they went to visit their mother again and found her awake and talking, some of the light came back to size. Mama, you scared me so much, said, hugging her mother carefully, mindful of all the tubes and wires. I'm sorry, baby, I didn't mean to scare you, but look, I'm getting better. The doctors say I'm going to be fine. Maria's got a new job, blurted out. A good one, with real money and health insurance and everything. Their mother looked at Maria with questioning eyes, and Maria explained about the foundation, about the offer, about the opportunity to help other people. As she talked, she saw pride bloom in her mother's face. Your father would be so proud, her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. We always wanted more for you girls, wanted you to have opportunities we never had, but we couldn't afford college, couldn't give you the chances we dreamed of, and now this. It's because of you, Mama, Maria said. You taught me to work hard, you taught me to care about people, you taught me to never give up even when things seemed impossible. Everything good in me comes from you and Papa. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, the 3 of them, talking and laughing and sometimes crying. The hospital room, which had seemed so sterile and frightening in the morning, became a place of healing not just for her mother's body, but for their family's collective spirit. Alexander and left in the late afternoon, but not before Alexander did something that surprised Maria. He took out his personal card and wrote his cell phone number on the back. If you or your family need anything, anything at all, You call this number, day or night, I mean that. I can't just call a billionaire's personal phone, Maria protested. Why not? I'm just a person, same as you. I eat, I sleep, I worry about things and hope for things, and sometimes I stay up too late watching terrible movies. The only difference between us is circumstances. So yes, you can call me. In fact, I'd consider it a favor if you did. I want to know how your mother's recovery goes. I want to hear about your first day at the foundation. I want to stay connected to this, to you, to the real impact of the work we're doing. After they left, Maria sat with her mother while went to get food from the cafeteria. They were quiet for a while, comfortable in each other's presence in a way they hadn't been for a long time. The stress and worry that had defined their relationship for the past 2 years seemed to have lifted, replaced by something calmer and more hopeful. Are you scared, her mother asked finally, about the new job? Terrified, Maria admitted. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I can do this. You can, you will. Because you're stronger than you know, smarter than you give yourself credit for, and you have something those rich people with their fancy degrees don't have. You know what it's like. You've lived it. That's worth more than any education. I'm going to make mistakes. Of course you will. Everyone makes mistakes. But you'll learn from them and you'll get better and you'll help people. That's what matters. Maria squeezed her mother's hand. I'm going to make enough money to move us out of that apartment, find us a better place. Somewhere safe, somewhere with heat that works and windows that close properly. Don't start spending money you haven't earned yet, her mother said with a weak laugh. But yes, someday that would be nice. For now, I'm just grateful to be alive. Grateful you have this opportunity. Grateful that maybe, finally, our family can stop just surviving and start actually living. That night, Maria stayed in the hospital sleeping room again. Before bed, Maria called Mrs. Park to update her on everything that had happened. The older woman listened in amazement, occasionally gasping or muttering prayers of thanks. God works in mysterious ways, Mrs. Park said when Maria finished. Who would have thought that running away in the rain would lead to all this? I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find it was all a dream, Maria confessed. Things like this don't happen to people like us. Maybe they should happen more often, Mrs. Park said. Maybe there are more good people out there than we think. We just don't usually meet them. After hanging up, Maria lay in bed thinking about that. For so long, she had seen the world in simple terms. The rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless, the people who mattered and the people who didn't. She had put herself firmly in the second category, had accepted that her role in life was to serve people who would never notice her, never care about her struggles, never see her as fully human. But Alexander Montgomery had shattered that simple view. He was rich and powerful, yes, but he was also someone who drove across the city in the middle of the night to help. Someone who sat in hospitals and made promises and followed through on them. Someone who saw a maid as a person worth helping, worth hearing, worth believing in. Maybe the world wasn't divided into good people and bad people, or rich and poor, or powerful and powerless. Maybe it was more complicated than that. Maybe there were people everywhere, in mansions and in apartments, in boardrooms and in kitchens, who cared, who tried, who wanted to make things better. And maybe, just maybe, Maria could be one of them. Not just someone who needed help, but someone who could give it. Not just a victim of circumstances, but someone who could change circumstances for others. The thought was both humbling and empowering. The next morning, Maria woke early and went to check on her mother before the breakfast rush began. She found her mother awake, looking out the window at the city below. The sun was rising, painting the buildings in shades of gold and pink, and for the first time in weeks, Maria's mother looked peaceful. Good morning, Mama, Maria said softly. Good morning, my dear. Come, sit with me, watch the sunrise. Maria pulled up a chair beside the bed, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the city wake up. From this height, in this quiet moment, the problems that had seemed so insurmountable felt more manageable. The future that had seemed so bleak felt like it might actually hold some light. You know what I was thinking, her mother said after a while. I was thinking about your father, how he always said our girls were going to do great things. I used to think he was just being optimistic, dreaming bigger than our circumstances allowed. But maybe he knew something I didn't. Maybe he saw something in you that I was too worried to see. Papa always believed in us, Maria agreed, even when we didn't believe in ourselves. I wish he could see this, see you about to start this new chapter, see that his faith in you was justified. I think he can see it, Maria said, surprising herself with the words. She wasn't usually religious, hadn't been to church in years except for her father's funeral. But in this moment, she felt a sense of presence, of connection to something larger than herself. "I think he's watching over us. I think he helped bring Alexander Montgomery to our door." Her mother smiled. "Maybe so, or maybe you brought yourself there with your courage and your love and your refusal to give up. Don't give all the credit to divine intervention. Take some credit for yourself." A nurse came in then, breaking their quiet moment, but Maria held her mother's words close to her heart. She had spent so long seeing herself as powerless, as a victim of circumstances, as someone things happened to rather than someone who made things happen. But her mother was right. She had made choices. She had worked hard. She had sacrificed. She had run into the rain to save her mother. Maybe she was stronger than she thought. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Maria and would spend their days at the hospital, reading to their mother, talking with her, helping her with physical therapy as she regained her strength. In the evenings, Maria would sit with via video call, learning about the Foundation's work, starting to understand the scope of what they did and what they could do better. Alexander visited every couple of days, always in the evening after his business obligations were finished. He never stayed long, never made a big production of his presence. He would check on Maria's mother, ask about her recovery, share a few words of encouragement. Then he would find Maria and ask how she was doing, really doing, under the surface politeness. On his third visit, he brought something unexpected, a letter of recommendation from the Montgomery estate. Not from Mrs., but from several of the other servants Maria had worked with over the years. They had written about her kindness, her hard work, her willingness to help others even when she was exhausted. "I thought you might want to keep this," Alexander said, handing her the folder. "Regardless of what happens with the Foundation, this is proof of who you are and what you're capable of. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself." Maria read the letters with tears in her eyes. She had thought she was invisible to her, just another person scrubbing floors alongside them. But they had noticed her. They had appreciated her. They had seen her worth even when she couldn't see it herself. "What about Mrs.?" Maria asked. "Is she angry about all this?" Alexander's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. and I have had several conversations about management style and employee treatment. She's been given a choice. Adapt to a new approach that treats staff as valuable human beings rather than interchangeable servants, or retire with a generous pension. She's chosen to retire." "You fired her because of me?" Maria asked, shocked. "I fired her because she created a work environment where someone felt they had to choose between their job and their dying mother. That's unacceptable. You just made me finally see what had been happening under my roof for years." Maria didn't know what to say to that. Part of her felt guilty. Mrs. had been stern and difficult, but she had also been doing her job as she understood it. But another part of Maria, a deeper part, felt validated. She had been treated badly. Her fear of asking for help had been justified, and now it was being acknowledged and addressed. "Who's going to replace her?" Maria asked. "I'm promoting James. You know him, the assistant groundskeeper. He's been with the family for 15 years and everyone likes and respects him. And he's agreed to work with to implement better policies for staff welfare, including an actual, functional employee assistance program that provides real help, not just advice." The week passed quickly. Maria's mother grew stronger each day, progressing from barely being able to sit up to walking short distances with a walker. The doctors were amazed at her recovery speed, though they cautioned that she would need months of rehabilitation at home. Her lungs had been damaged by the infection and would need time to fully heal. On the day before her mother was scheduled to be released, Alexander came to visit with news. "I've arranged for a home health aide to visit your mother 3 times a week for the next 3 months, he said. "To help with exercises, monitor her progress, make sure she's healing properly. The Foundation is also providing a delivery service for groceries and medications, so neither of you needs to worry about that while you're helping your mother recover and starting your new job." "That's too much," Maria protested, even though she knew they desperately needed the help. "It's what's necessary," Alexander corrected. "Maria, you can't help other people if you're drowning yourself. Let us help you so you can heal, so your family can recover, and then you can turn around and help others. That's how it works. We all help each other." Maria thought about that philosophy, so different from the survival of the fittest mentality she had always operated under. What if the world really could work that way? What if people really could help each other, not because they expected something in return, but because they understood that everyone's was connected? It seemed impossibly idealistic. But then again, a week ago, her mother being alive had seemed impossible. A week ago, Maria having a future beyond scrubbing floors had seemed impossible. Maybe impossible things happened more often than she had thought. On the day her mother was released from the hospital, a medical transport van arrived to take them home. Maria had expected a cramped ambulance, but instead found a comfortable vehicle with easy entry and soft seats. The driver was patient and kind, helping her mother with gentle expertise. When they arrived at the apartment building, Maria's heart sank. After a week in the clean, modern hospital, returning to their rundown building felt like going backwards. But when they climbed the stairs to the third floor, they found Mrs. Park and several other neighbors waiting with cleaning supplies and food. "We heard you were coming home," Mrs. Park said. "So we cleaned the apartment and brought enough food for a week. You don't need to worry about anything except resting." The apartment had been scrubbed clean. The windows that usually stuck had been opened to let in fresh air. The refrigerator, usually nearly empty, was packed with meals in containers. On the small kitchen table was a bouquet of flowers with a card from all the neighbors, welcoming Maria's mother home. Maria's mother sat on the couch, which had been cleaned and covered with a fresh blanket, and looked around with tears in her eyes. "I never knew we had so many people who cared," she said. "We're neighbors," Mrs. Park said simply. "We look out for each other, that's what we do." That night, after the neighbors had left and had fallen asleep in her bed, Maria sat with her mother in the small living room. The apartment was quiet, lit by a single lamp, and through the window they could see the lights of the city twinkling in the darkness. "You start your new job in 2 weeks," her mother said. "How are you feeling about it?" "Scared, excited, grateful, all of it at once." "You're going to do wonderful things, Maria. I know it. I just want to help people, the way we were helped. I want to make sure other families don't have to choose between keeping their job and saving someone they love. I want to make sure other mothers get medicine before they're dying instead of after." "Then do that, and remember where you came from. Remember what it felt like to need help and not know where to find it. Let that drive you, but don't let it consume you. You've earned the right to also live your life, to be happy, to dream your own dreams." Maria thought about that as she prepared for bed that night. For so long, her life had been about survival, about keeping her head above water, about doing whatever it took to get through another day. She had forgotten how to dream, had forgotten that life could be about more than just not dying. But now, with her mother healing and a new job waiting and possibilities opening up, maybe it was time to remember how to dream again. Maybe it was time to imagine not just survival, but flourishing. Not just getting by, but actually thriving. As she drifted off to sleep, Maria thought about all the people out there who were still struggling the way she had been struggling a week ago. People who were working themselves to exhaustion, people who were choosing between medicine and food, people who were falling through the cracks in a system that claimed to care, but so often didn't. In 2 weeks, she would start trying to catch some of them. She would start trying to build a better safety net, one person at a time. It seemed impossible, overwhelming, like trying to empty an ocean with a teaspoon. But a week ago, her mother being alive had seemed impossible too. And yet here they were together, safe, with a future ahead of them that held actual hope. Maybe impossible things could happen after all. Maybe one person really could make a difference. Maybe Maria Santos, former maid, daughter of a seamstress and a factory worker, could actually change the world. For so Maria's first day at the Montgomery Foundation was nothing like she had expected. She had imagined a cold office building full of busy people who would look at her with skepticism, wondering why someone with no college degree had been hired for such an important position. She had prepared herself for judgment, for condescension, for the feeling of being out of place. Instead, she found herself in a modern but warm office space decorated with photos of the people the foundation had helped. The walls were covered with thank you letters, children's drawings, and news clippings about successful interventions. Met her at the door with a genuine smile and a cup of coffee prepared exactly how Maria liked it, which she had somehow remembered from their brief conversations. "Welcome to your first day," said, guiding Maria through the office. "I want you to meet everyone and then we'll get you set up at your desk." There were about 20 people working in the office, and every single one of them stopped what they were doing to welcome Maria personally. They weren't just being polite. They were genuinely interested in her story, in her perspective, in what she could bring to the team. Several of them shared their own stories of why they had come to work for the foundation. A woman named Jennifer had lost her brother to diabetes because he couldn't afford insulin. A man named had grown up in foster care and understood what it meant to fall through the system's cracks. They weren't just doing jobs, they were fighting battles that had personal meaning to them. Maria's desk was in a corner with a window overlooking the city. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. She had a computer, a phone, supplies in the drawers, and a small plant that said was from Alexander with a note that read, "Every new beginning deserves something living and growing. Welcome to the team." The first week was overwhelming in the best possible way. Spent hours teaching Maria about the Foundation's programs, walking her through case files, explaining the application process and the criteria for assistance. Maria learned that the Foundation helped with far more than just emergency medical care. They provided assistance with prescription medications, medical equipment, mental health services, dental care, and even transportation to medical appointments for people who had no way to get there. But as Maria reviewed the files, patterns began to emerge that troubled her. The people being helped were predominantly white, predominantly from middle-class backgrounds who had experienced a temporary setback. Very few applications came from neighborhoods like the one Maria lived in, where poverty was generational and systemic rather than circumstantial. "Why aren't we reaching more people from low-income communities?" Maria asked during a team meeting at the end of her first week. There was an uncomfortable silence. Finally, Jennifer spoke up. "We've tried outreach in those areas. We've put up flyers, sent information to community centers, but we don't get many applications." "Maybe that's because people don't believe it's real," Maria said, thinking of her own skepticism about charity. "Or maybe the application process is too complicated. Can I see a blank application?" Pulled one up on the screen, and Maria's heart sank as she scrolled through it. It was 10 pages long, full of questions about tax returns and employment history and medical documentation. It required access to a computer and scanner. It asked for information that many poor people simply didn't have or couldn't easily obtain. "This is designed for people who have stability," Maria said carefully, not wanting to offend anyone on her first week. "People with jobs and tax returns and the ability to gather medical records. But the people who need help most don't have those things. My mother doesn't file tax returns because she doesn't make enough money. How would she have answered these questions?" The room was quiet again, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence this time. It was the silence of people thinking, of realization dawning. "You're right," said slowly. "We designed this application based on what we needed to verify eligibility and prevent fraud, but we made it so complicated that we're excluding the very people we most want to help." "So how do we fix it?" asked, leaning forward with interest. Maria spent the next several hours with the team, going through the application question by question, identifying barriers. They reduced the number of required documents, created alternative ways to verify eligibility that didn't depend on having a stable address or formal employment. They kept the necessary safeguards, but removed the unnecessary obstacles. By the end of the day, they had a new application that was 3 pages instead of 10, with clear instructions in multiple languages, and options for phone-based applications for people without computer access. "This is good," said, looking at their work with satisfaction. "But it's still just the first step. We need to get the word out, and we need to rebuild trust with communities that have learned not to trust promises of help." "I can do that," Maria said. "Let me go to my neighborhood, let me talk to people face to face, let me show them this is real." The following week, Maria returned to her own community as a representative of the Montgomery Foundation. She had arranged to use a room at the community center 3 afternoons a week, and she had spent her evenings going door to door, talking to neighbors, inviting them to come learn about resources that might help them. The first afternoon, only Mrs. Park and 2 other elderly women showed up. Maria gave them her presentation anyway, explaining the Foundation's services, walking them through the application, offering to help them apply right there if they were interested. Mrs. Park applied for help with her arthritis medications, which had become unaffordable on her fixed income. One of the other women needed a hearing aid but couldn't afford it. Maria helped them both complete applications, took photos of their basic documents with her phone, and submitted everything before they left. "Will this really work?" Mrs. Park asked skeptically. "Or is this just another program that makes promises it doesn't keep?" "It will work," Maria promised. I've seen it work. My mother is alive because of this foundation. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't real. By the third week, word had spread. 20 people showed up to Maria's session, then 30, then 40. They came with medical bills they couldn't pay, prescriptions they couldn't afford to fill, dental problems they had been ignoring for years because they couldn't afford treatment. They came with stories that broke Maria's heart, stories she recognized because they were so similar to her own. There was a single father whose daughter needed glasses, but he had been making her use an old prescription because new ones cost too much. There was an elderly man who had been rationing his diabetes medication, taking half doses to make it last longer, slowly killing himself to save money. There was a young woman with severe anxiety who had stopped taking her medication because she couldn't afford both the pills and her rent. Maria helped them all. She sat with each person, listened to their story, helped them navigate the application. She took their fear and transformed it into hope. And when applications were approved, which most of them were within days rather than weeks, she made sure they knew how to access their benefits, how to work with the approved providers, how to get the help they had been promised. But it wasn't just about processing applications. Maria started to see the bigger picture, the systemic problems that no single foundation could solve. She saw how medical debt trapped people in poverty, how the fear of getting sick kept people from seeking preventive care, how the complexity of the healthcare system intimidated people into suffering in silence. She started documenting everything. She kept detailed notes about the barriers people faced, the fears they expressed, the ways the system failed them. She brought these insights back to the Foundation's team meetings, and together they began to develop new programs and approaches. They created a medical bill negotiation service, where trained advocates would work with hospitals and doctors on behalf of patients to reduce charges. They established a medication savings program that helped people find the cheapest sources for their prescriptions. They partnered with dental schools to provide low-cost dental care. They even started a medical transportation service using volunteer drivers to help people get to appointments. Alexander attended many of these meetings, often just sitting quietly in the back of the room, listening. Maria had learned that he preferred to empower his team rather than dictate to them. He would ask questions, offer perspectives, provide resources when needed, but he trusted the people doing the work to know what the work needed. One day, about 2 months into Maria's new job, Alexander asked her to have lunch with him. They went to a small near the office, far from the fancy restaurants where Maria imagined billionaires usually ate. "I wanted to check in with you," he said as they waited for their food. "Really check in? How are you doing with all of this?" Maria considered the question carefully. "I'm exhausted," she admitted. "Every story I hear takes something out of me. Every person who comes to me for help, I see my mother, I see my family, I see myself. It's hard not to take it personally." "That's because it is personal," Alexander said. "That's what makes you good at this, but you also need to take care of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup." "I know, it's just, there are so many people who need help. How do I choose who to help first? How do I tell someone they have to wait when I know waiting might mean dying?" "You do your best and you trust that your best is good enough. You help who you can when you can, as much as you can. And you remember that you're not alone in this. You have a whole team, a whole foundation working toward the same goals." Their food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Then Alexander spoke again. "I've been thinking about something you said in one of the team meetings, about how we're treating symptoms but not the disease. How medical debt is just one manifestation of a larger problem of poverty and inequality." "I probably sounded naive," Maria said, embarrassed. "I don't have the economic education to really understand." "No, you were right. We are treating symptoms. And while that's important, people need immediate help, they need medicine and care right now. You made me think about whether we should be doing more. Whether we should be advocating for systemic change, not just helping individuals navigate a broken system." Maria looked at him in surprise. "You mean like lobbying, trying to change laws?" "Maybe, or maybe supporting grassroots organizations that are already doing that work, or funding research into the economic impacts of medical debt, or partnering with other foundations to create a unified voice for healthcare reform." He paused. "What would you think about leading that initiative?" Maria nearly choked on her sandwich. "Me? I've been here for 2 months. I'm still learning how to process applications correctly." "You've been living this issue your entire life. You understand it in a way that someone with a public policy degree never could. And you have credibility. You're not some out-of-touch rich person telling poor people what they need. You're someone who has lived it, survived it, and is trying to make it better for others. I don't know if I'm ready for that. Nobody ever feels ready for the next challenge, but I've watched you over these past 2 months. You're a natural leader. People trust you. People listen to you. You could make a real difference on a larger scale. Maria thought about it as they finished their lunch. The idea terrified her, but it also excited her. What if she really could help change the system, not just help individuals navigate it? What if her story, her experience, her voice could be part of a larger movement for change? Can I think about it? She asked. Of course, take all the time you need. That evening, Maria talked it over with her mother, who had made remarkable progress in her recovery. She was back to doing light work from home, mending clothes for neighbors, regaining her independence day by day. Do you remember when you first got sick? Maria asked her mother. Do you remember how scared we all were? Of course I remember. I thought I was dying. I thought I was going to leave you girls alone. If someone had asked you then what needed to change, what would you have said? Her mother thought for a long moment. I would have said that nobody should have to choose between medicine and food. Nobody should have to die because they're poor. Nobody should have to feel like their life is worth less just because they don't have money. Alexander wants me to work on making those changes, not just helping individuals, but trying to change the whole system. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. Then you have to do it, you have to try, because if you don't, who will? Who better than someone who knows exactly what it's like? Over the next several weeks, Maria dove into research. She read studies about medical debt and its impacts on families. She learned about successful healthcare models in other countries. She connected with advocacy organizations and grassroots movements. She interviewed dozens of people who had been impacted by medical debt, documenting their stories, building a picture of the human cost of the broken system. She also continued her community outreach work. The sessions at the community center had become so popular that she had to expand to multiple days per week. She had trained several volunteers from the community to help with basic application assistance, which freed her up to handle more complex cases and to think about the bigger picture. One of her regular attendees was a woman named who had 4 children and 2 jobs, but still couldn't afford health care for her family. His youngest son had asthma, and she had been buying his inhaler medications from unlicensed vendors because she couldn't afford the prescription prices. It's illegal, I know, told Maria, shame in her voice. But what am I supposed to do? Let my son stop breathing, listen to him wheeze and gasp and pray he doesn't have a bad attack. Maria helped apply for assistance and got her son's medications covered within a week. But she couldn't stop thinking about all the other parents out there making similar desperate choices, risking illegal purchases because legal options were unaffordable. She brought story to Alexander, along with dozens of others she had collected. This is what I mean about systemic problems, she said, spreading out the files on his desk. We can help and we should, but there are thousands of out there, millions, until we change the system that makes life-saving medication so expensive that people resort to illegal purchases. We're just putting band-aids on bullet wounds. Alexander read through the files, his expression growing more troubled with each story. You're right, he said finally. So let's do something about it. Let's start building a coalition, other foundations, advocacy groups, affected individuals. Let's bring together everyone who has a stake in fixing this broken system, and let's start pushing for real change. That sounds impossible, Maria said. 6 months ago, you thought your mother surviving was impossible. 3 months ago, you thought working here was impossible. Maybe it's time to expand your definition of what's possible. The next phase of Maria's work began. While continuing her community outreach, she started building connections with other organizations working on healthcare access issues. She traveled to meetings and conferences. Her first time ever on an airplane, her first time staying in hotels, her first time being treated as an expert rather than a supplicant. At first, she felt like she was at tables with people who had doctorates and decades of experience. But she quickly learned that her perspective was valuable precisely because it was different. She could speak to the lived reality of healthcare poverty in a way that moved people, that made abstract statistics feel human and urgent. She told story at a national conference on healthcare access. She talked about her mother's near-death experience, about the choice between rent and medicine, about communities where poverty was so pervasive that people couldn't even imagine asking for help. When she finished speaking, the room gave her a standing ovation. Afterward, dozens of people approached her wanting to connect, wanting to collaborate, wanting to hear more. She exchanged contact information with representatives from major foundations, with grassroots organizers, with researchers, with journalists interested in covering these issues. "You were amazing up there," Alexander said as they left the conference. He had attended to support her, sitting in the audience rather than on the stage where his wealth and name might have overshadowed her message. "I was terrified," Maria admitted. "I kept thinking about how different my life was just a few months ago, how I was scrubbing floors and now I'm speaking at national conferences. It doesn't feel real." "It's real because you made it real. You took an opportunity and you ran with it. You're making a difference, Maria. A real, measurable difference." Back at the foundation, Maria's community outreach program had grown so successful that they were considering expanding it to other neighborhoods, other cities. Maria was training new outreach workers, teaching them not just how to process applications, but how to build trust, how to listen, how to see the person behind the paperwork. One of her trainees was a young man named David who had grown up in the foster care system and understood what it meant to navigate bureaucracy while feeling powerless. Another was an older woman named Rose who had survived cancer but had been bankrupted by the medical bills. They brought their own stories, their own perspectives, their own authenticity to the work. "You're building something that will outlast you," told Maria one day. "You're not just helping individuals, you're creating a model for how to do this work with dignity and effectiveness. Other organizations are already asking if they can replicate your approach." Maria felt a sense of pride she had never experienced before. Not pride in her wealth or status. She still lived in the same modest apartment with her mother and sister, though they were looking at slightly nicer places now that she had a steady income. But pride in her work, in the difference she was making, in the lives she was changing. Her mother's health continued to improve. She would never have perfect lungs again. The pneumonia had left permanent damage. But she could breathe, could work, could live. She had started taking in more sewing work and had even begun teaching some of her skills. Inspired by everything that had happened, had started volunteering at a local community health clinic, thinking she might want to become a nurse someday. "Look at us," Maria's mother said one evening as they sat together in their small living room. "6 months ago, I was dying. You were scrubbing floors, was so scared she could barely function. And now look, you're changing the world, has dreams again, and I'm alive to see it all. How did we get so lucky?" "It wasn't luck," Maria said. "Or maybe it was partly, but it was also persistence. It was you teaching us to never give up. It was being brave enough to call for help. It was me running through the rain because I couldn't just let you die. And yes, it was also Alexander Montgomery choosing to be someone who helps instead of someone who just protects his own wealth. But mostly, it was all of us refusing to accept that this was how our story had to end." As the months passed, Maria's role at the foundation continued to evolve. She was no longer just the community outreach coordinator. She had become the public face of the foundation's work with communities. She gave interviews to newspapers and magazines. She had city council meetings about healthcare access. She met with politicians and advocates and organizers, always bringing the stories of real people, always making sure the faces behind the statistics were seen and heard. She also made sure those people were part of the conversation. When she was invited to speak at events, she brought community members with her. When journalists wanted to do stories, she connected them with people like and Mrs. Park and the single father with the daughter who needed glasses. She used her platform not to elevate herself, but to elevate the voices of people who were usually ignored. Alexander continued to be a steady presence, supportive but not controlling. He provided resources when needed, opened doors with his connections, but never tried to take credit or control the direction of the work. He had meant what he said about empowering his team. One day, almost a year after that desperate midnight run through the rain, Alexander asked Maria to meet him at the Montgomery estate. She hadn't been back since the night she had stolen the keys and run away, and she felt strange returning as a guest rather than a servant. The mansion looked the same, imposing and beautiful, but Maria saw it differently now. She saw the excess, the waste, the resources that could be deployed to help so many people. But she also saw that Alexander was using those resources, that he was trying to leverage his privilege for good. He met her at the main entrance, not the servants' entrance she had always used before. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I have something I want to show you." He led her through the mansion to his private office, a room she had never been allowed to enter as a servant. The walls were covered with photos, including several that surprised her. There were pictures from the community center where she did her outreach work, pictures of people she had helped, newspaper articles about the foundation's expanded programs. "I keep these here to remind myself why I do this work," Alexander explained. "My business deals, my investments, my wealth, they're just tools. This is what actually matters, the lives we change, the differences we make." He gestured for her to sit and pulled out a folder. "I wanted to tell you first before we announce it publicly. The Foundation is establishing a new program. We're calling it the Santos Initiative for Healthcare Equity." Maria stared at him. "You're nomming it after me." "After you and your mother, actually. It will focus on providing comprehensive support for families dealing with medical crises. Not just emergency care, but ongoing treatment, rehabilitation, mental health support, everything needed for true recovery and stability. And it will be dedicated to reaching the communities that have been most by our healthcare system." "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. You've earned this recognition. Your work has transformed our foundation's approach. You've taught us how to actually serve the people we claim to want to help. Having your name on this program ensures that your vision, your values, your understanding of what people really need will guide this work into the future." Maria felt tears on her cheeks. "My mother is going to cry when she hears this." "I hope she will," Alexander said with a smile. "I hope she's proud. She should be. She raised a daughter who changed lives, who refused to accept injustice, who turned personal tragedy into purpose." They talked for another hour about the details of the new initiative, about Maria's role in leading it, about the resources that would be dedicated to it. As they talked, Maria kept thinking about how surreal this all was. A year ago, she had been invisible in this house, just another servant in a uniform. Now she was sitting in the owner's private office, discussing a program that bore her name, planning how to change the healthcare system for millions of people. When she left the estate that evening, Maria didn't feel the shame and fear she had felt the last time she walked away. She felt pride. She felt purpose. She felt like she belonged in the world, like her voice mattered, like her life had meaning beyond survival. She went home and told her mother everything. They cried together, holding each other, thinking about how far they had come from that desperate night when death had seemed inevitable and hope had seemed foolish. "Papa would be so proud," her mother said. "So very proud. I wish he could see it." Maybe he can. Maybe he's watching over us, smiling at how his daughter turned tragedy into triumph. That night, Maria lay in bed thinking about the future. There was still so much work to do, so many people to help, so many systems to change. But for the first time in her life, she felt equipped to do it. She had skills, she had resources, she had a team, she had purpose. And most importantly, she had proof that change was possible. She had proof that one person really could make a difference. She had proof that running through the rain in the middle of the night, refusing to accept that this was how the story had to end, could actually change everything. The Santos Initiative for Healthcare Equity would officially launch in 3 months. Maria would spend that time preparing, building partnerships, training staff, developing programs. But in this quiet moment, alone with her thoughts, she allowed herself to simply feel gratitude. Gratitude for her mother's survival. Gratitude for Alexander's kindness. Gratitude for the opportunity to turn her pain into purpose. The launch event for the Santos Initiative for Healthcare Equity took place on a warm spring evening, exactly 1 year and 3 months after the night Maria had run through the rain to save her mother. The foundation had rented a community center in Maria's neighborhood rather than holding the event at some fancy hotel downtown. This was deliberate. Maria had insisted that the launch happen in the community the program was designed to serve. The center was packed with people from all walks of life. There were community members who had been helped by Maria's outreach work. There were representatives from other nonprofits and advocacy organizations. There were journalists and city officials and healthcare providers who had partnered with the foundation. And there were the people Maria considered most important, the individuals whose stories had shaped the program, whose struggles had informed every aspect of its design. Was there with her 4 children, including her youngest son who no longer had to ration his asthma medication. Mrs. Park was there, her arthritis pain managed with medications she could now afford. The single father was there with his daughter, who wore new glasses and couldn't stop smiling. David and Rose, Maria's trainees who had become full outreach coordinators, stood near the front, proud to be part of something transformative. Maria's mother and sister sat in the front row. Her mother looked beautiful in a new dress that she had made herself, her health restored enough that she could work again, could dream again, could watch her daughter become someone she had always believed she could be. Sat beside her, wearing her volunteer uniform from the community health clinic, already pursuing her dream of becoming a nurse. Alexander stood at the back of the room, deliberately staying out of the spotlight. He had learned over the past year that his presence could sometimes overshadow the work itself. Tonight was about the program, about the people it would serve, about Maria's vision for how healthcare equity could be achieved. His role was to support, not to center himself. Stepped to the podium to begin the event. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here to celebrate the launch of the Santos Initiative for Healthcare Equity. This program represents everything our foundation aspires to be, responsive to real needs, designed by those who understand the problems firsthand, and committed to not just treating symptoms but addressing root causes. She paused, looking out at the diverse crowd. A year ago, we thought we were doing good work. We were helping people, providing resources, making a difference. But we were also failing in ways we didn't fully understand. We were missing the very people who needed us most. Our processes were too complicated, our outreach too limited, our understanding too shallow. And then Maria Santos joined our team and showed us what we were doing wrong, and more importantly, how to do it right. Gestured for Maria to join her at the podium. Maria stood, her heart pounding, and walked to the front. She had spoken at conferences and meetings before, but this felt different. These were her neighbors, her community, people who had known her when she was just a struggling maid sending money home to her sick mother. They knew where she came from. They knew her story wasn't a fairy tale, but a hard-won journey. Thank you all for coming, Maria began, her voice steadier than she felt. A year and 3 months ago, I was a maid at the Montgomery estate. I worked 12-hour shifts scrubbing floors and polishing silver. I sent most of my paycheck home to support my mother and sister. And when my mother got sick, really sick, sick enough to die, I didn't know where to turn for help. She saw people nodding, recognizing their own struggles in her words. I couldn't afford doctors, I couldn't afford medicine, I couldn't even afford to take time off work to care for her. I felt powerless and terrified and alone. And then in the middle of the night when my mother stopped breathing, I made a choice. I ran. I left my job without permission, stole keys to escape the estate, and rushed home thinking I was about to watch my mother die. Maria's voice caught, but she pushed through. What I didn't know was that running away that night would change everything. Mr. Montgomery tracked me down not to punish me but to help. He got my mother the medical care that saved her life, and then he offered me something I never expected, a chance to help others the way he had helped us. She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. This program, the Santos Initiative, isn't just about me. It's about every single person in this room who has struggled to afford health care. It's about who bought illegal medications for her son because legal ones cost too much. It's about Mrs. Park, who chose between her medications and her groceries. It's about my mother, who almost died because pneumonia treatment was too expensive. It's about all of us who have learned that in this country, being poor can be a death sentence. The room was completely silent, everyone hanging on her words. But it doesn't have to be that way. The Santos Initiative is designed to break down the barriers that keep people from getting the care they need. We've the application process. We're bringing services directly to communities instead of making people come to us. We're providing not just emergency care but long-term support. We're helping people navigate the complex healthcare system. And most importantly, we're listening, really listening to what people need instead of assuming we know better. She pulled out a piece of paper, the original 10-page application form the foundation had used before she joined. This was what we used to ask people to fill out. 10 pages of questions that assumed you had a stable address, steady employment, access to a computer, and the ability to gather complex documentation. How many people in this room could have completed this while dealing with a medical crisis? Nobody raised their hands. Maria held up another paper, the 3-page version they had created. This is what we use now. 3 pages, simple language, multiple ways to verify eligibility, options for phone or in-person applications. Because we finally understood that if we make it too hard for people to ask for help, we're not really helping at all. She set down the papers and gripped the podium. But here's the truth. Individual assistance programs aren't enough. We can help, and Mrs. Park and thousands of others, and we should. But unless we change the system that makes healthcare unaffordable in the first place, we're just putting bandages on a wound that keeps bleeding. This was the part she was most nervous about, the transition from talking about what the program did to talking about what needed to change more broadly. The Santos initiative includes a strong advocacy component. We're going to work with other organizations to push for policy changes. We're going to support grassroots movements demanding healthcare reform. We're going to tell stories, your stories, to lawmakers and journalists and anyone who will listen, because your struggles aren't personal failures. They're policy failures, and policies can be changed. The room erupted in applause. Maria felt her eyes filling with tears, but she smiled through them. These were her people, her community, and they understood what she was saying because they had lived it. When the applause died down, Maria continued. I want to tell you about the specific services the initiative will provide. First, we have an emergency assistance fund for immediate medical crises. If you or someone you love is facing a life-threatening situation and can't afford care, we can help within hours, not weeks. She clicked to a slide showing the program components. Second, we have ongoing medication assistance. If you need regular medications that you can't afford, we work with pharmaceutical companies and pharmacies to reduce costs or provide them for free. Third, we provide medical equipment and supplies. Wheelchairs, oxygen tanks, diabetic supplies, hearing aids. If you need it to manage your health, we help you get it. Fourth, we offer care coordination. Our team helps you navigate the healthcare system, schedule appointments, understand your treatment options, and advocate for yourself with providers. Fifth, we provide mental health support. Medical crises are traumatic. Financial stress is traumatic. You shouldn't have to deal with that alone. We connect people with counselors and support groups. And finally, we offer financial counseling and medical bill negotiation. If you're drowning in medical debt, we have experts who can help you negotiate with hospitals and set up manageable payment plans. She paused to let all of this sink in. These services are free. You don't pay us back. There are no strings attached. We're funded by the Montgomery Foundation and other donors who believe that healthcare is a right, not a privilege. An elderly man in the audience raised his hand. What if we don't qualify? What if we make too much money or don't have the right paperwork? Our eligibility criteria are broad, Maria assured him. If you're struggling to afford healthcare, you probably qualify, and even if you don't qualify for direct assistance, we'll help you find resources that can help. We're not here to turn people away. We're here to help however we can. A young woman spoke up. How do we know this is different from other programs that promise to help but were too complicated or too slow? It was a fair question, one that reflected the deep skepticism Maria herself had felt before all of this happened. That's why we're doing this launch here, in this community center, instead of at some fancy event downtown. That's why I'm standing here telling you my personal story instead of reading from a corporate script. That's why we have outreach workers from this community who understand your struggles because they've lived them too. She gestured to David and Rose. David grew up in foster care. Rose survived cancer but was bankrupted by medical bills. They're part of our team because they get it. They've been where you are, and we're accountable to this community. If we're not doing our job right, I want you to tell us. This is your program. We work for you, not the other way around. The questions continued for nearly an hour. People wanted to know about specific situations, about how to apply, about whether the program could help with dental work or vision care or transportation to appointments. Maria answered each question patiently, thoroughly, sometimes saying, I don't know, but I'll find out when she didn't have an immediate answer. Finally, returned to the podium. We have enrollment stations set up around the room. If you want to apply for assistance tonight, our team is here to help. We also have information packets with details about all our services and how to access them. And Maria will be at the community center 3 days a week for walk-in assistance. As people lined up at the enrollment stations, Maria found herself surrounded by community members wanting to thank her, to share their stories, to express their hope that things might actually get better. She hugged Mrs. Park. She listened to an elderly veteran explain his struggles with VA healthcare. She held the hand of a young mother whose son needed surgery they couldn't afford. Each story reinforced why this work mattered, why she had been right to take the risk of leaving her safe if limiting job as a maid, why fighting for systemic change was worth the effort and frustration. Alexander approached her during a quiet moment. You were incredible up there, he said. You spoke from the heart and people heard you. I was terrified, Maria admitted. I kept thinking about how a year ago I was invisible, and now people are listening to me, trusting me with their stories, believing I can help. That's because you've earned their trust. You've shown up. You've done the work. You've made a real difference in real lives. That's not something you can fake or buy. That's something you build through action and commitment. A journalist who had been covering the event approached them. Ms. Santos, Mr. Montgomery, could I ask you both a few questions? They agreed, and the journalist pulled out a recording device. Ms. Santos, your transformation from maid to program director is remarkable. Some might see it as a Cinderella story. How do you respond to that characterization? Maria bristled slightly at the comparison. This isn't a fairy tale. I didn't get rescued by a prince. I fought for my mother's life. I took enormous risks, and I've worked incredibly hard over the past year to prove I deserve this opportunity. Yes, Mr. Montgomery provided the initial help and the opportunity, but I'm the one who has built relationships in the community, who has processed hundreds of applications, who has trained new staff, who has advocated for policy changes. This isn't about being rescued. This is about being given a chance and making the most of it. Fair point, the journalist conceded. Mr. Montgomery, why did you decide to help Ms. Santos that night? What made her situation different from the thousands of other employees and people in need? Alexander thought for a moment before answering. Honestly, timing and proximity. Mrs. called me about Maria leaving, and something about the situation bothered me. I realized she must have been dealing with a serious emergency to risk her job like that, and I had the resources to help, so I went. But Maria's right. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a story about what happens when resources meet need, when people with power choose to use it to help rather than just protect their own interests. And it's a story about what one person can do when given an opportunity. He looked at Maria with genuine respect. The help I provided was one night, one hospital stay, one job offer. Everything since then, the community outreach, the program redesign, the advocacy work, this initiative we're launching tonight, that's all Maria. She took a terrible situation and transformed it into something that will help thousands of people. That's not about me rescuing anyone. That's about recognizing talent and potential and getting out of the way while someone does extraordinary work. The journalist asked several more questions about the initiative's funding, its goals, its potential for expansion to other cities. Alexander handled the financial and administrative questions while Maria spoke to the community impact and the human stories behind the statistics. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, many stopped to thank Maria personally. A man whose wife was fighting cancer told her that the medication assistance program had literally saved his family from bankruptcy. A woman whose son had special needs explained that the care coordination services had helped her navigate a bewildering maze of providers and treatments. A teenager whose single mother had been afraid to seek treatment for depression thanked Maria for the mental health support that had saved her mom's life. Each story was a reminder of why this work mattered, why individual lives mattered, why fighting against seemingly insurmountable systemic problems was worth the effort. After everyone had left, Maria helped clean up the community center alongside the foundation staff and volunteers. She didn't feel above this work. She had spent years cleaning, and there was no shame in it. Besides, her mother had always taught her that no job was beneath you if it needed doing. You don't have to help clean up, said, trying to take a trash bag from Maria's hands. You're the program director. I'm also someone who knows how to clean a room, Maria replied with a smile. And I'm not too fancy to help. As they worked, David approached her. Can I tell you something? When I first heard they were hearing you, I was skeptical. I thought it was a publicity stunt, you know. Rich guy helps poor maid makes himself look good. But watching you over this past year, seeing how hard you work, how much you care, how you've transformed the foundation's approach, I was wrong. You deserve to be here. You've earned every bit of respect you get. Thank you, Maria said, genuinely touched. But you know what? Your skepticism was valid. We should be skeptical of feel-good stories that don't result in real change. The only reason I've been able to do this work is because Alexander really did step back and let me do it, because really did support my ideas even when they challenged the status, because people like you and Rose joined the team and did the hard work in communities. This isn't about any one person. It's about all of us committing to actually making things better. By the time they finished cleaning, it was nearly midnight. Maria stood outside the community center, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city lights. She thought about another midnight 15 months ago when she had stood outside in the rain, desperate and terrified, with no idea what the future held. If someone had told her then that she would be standing here now, having just launched a healthcare equity program bearing her name, she would have thought they were crazy. The distance between that panicked maid stealing keys and this confident program director seemed impossibly vast. And yet she was the same person. She hadn't become someone else. She had just been given the opportunity to become more fully herself, to use her experiences and her empathy and her determination to make a difference. Her phone rang. It was her mother. "I'm still awake. How did it go?" "It was perfect, Mama. People came, they listened, they enrolled in the program. We're going to help so many people." "Your father is smiling in heaven," her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "My daughter changing the world, who would have thought?" "You thought, Mama. You always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Come home soon. I made your favorite soup. You must be exhausted." Maria smiled. Her mother's answer to everything was still food and love. "I'll be home in half an hour. Save me some." As she walked to catch the bus, she still took public transportation most days, despite now being able to afford a car. Maria reflected on how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. She still lived in the same neighborhood, though they had moved to a slightly nicer apartment. She still took the bus and shopped at the same stores and knew all her neighbors by name. She still helped her mother with household chores and made sure was keeping up with her schoolwork. The money and the title and the recognition hadn't fundamentally changed who she was. She was still Maria Santos, daughter of a seamstress and a factory worker, sister too, member of a community that had always looked out for each other even when they had nothing to give. The difference was that now she had resources. She had a platform. She had the ability to help people in ways she had never dreamed possible. And she was determined to use those things not to escape her community, but to lift it up, to bring resources and attention and change to the places and people who needed it most. Over the next several months, the Santos Initiative exceeded everyone's expectations. They helped over 5,000 people in the first 6 months alone. They negotiated away millions of dollars in medical debt. They connected people with life-saving treatments and medications. They provided mental health support to families dealing with medical trauma. They helped elderly people get hearing aids and glasses, helped diabetics afford insulin, helped cancer patients access experimental treatments. But Maria was most proud of the advocacy work. They had joined a coalition of organizations pushing for state-level healthcare reforms. They had brought community members to testify at legislative hearings. They had worked with journalists to publish investigative stories about healthcare price gouging and insurance company practices. They had organized rallies and letter-writing campaigns and voter registration drives. The work was hard and progress was slow, but it was happening. A bill to cap insulin prices had passed the state legislature. A program to provide free preventive care in communities had been funded. Hospitals were being required to provide more transparent pricing and better financial assistance information. Each small victory felt enormous because Maria knew what it meant in human terms. It meant fewer people like buying illegal medications. It meant fewer mothers like hers choosing between rent and doctor visits. It meant fewer families being destroyed by medical debt. Maria also made sure to stay connected to the direct service work. She still spent time at the community center, still helped people fill out applications, still listened to their stories. It would have been easy to get caught up in the administrative and advocacy work, to lose touch with the ground-level reality. But she refused to let that happen. She remembered too clearly what it felt like to need help and not know where to find it. One evening, almost 2 years after that desperate midnight run, Maria was at the community center when a young woman came in who looked vaguely familiar. She was in her early 20s, dressed in a maid's uniform, and she looked exhausted and worried. "Can I help you?" Maria asked gently. The young woman hesitated, then said, "I work at a big house on the north side. My father is sick, really sick. He needs surgery, but we don't have insurance and we can't afford it. I don't know what to do. Someone told me there might be help here." Maria's heart clenched. She saw herself in this young woman, saw the fear, the exhaustion, the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, someone would help. "Yes," Maria said firmly. "We can help. Sit down and tell me everything." As the young woman told her story, the sick father, the medical bills, the impossible choice between work and family, Maria filled out the application with her, asked the right questions, and reassured her that help was available. Within an hour, they had submitted everything, and Maria was confident the application would be approved within days. "I don't understand," the young woman said, tears streaming down her face. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." Maria thought about how to answer. She could tell the young woman her own story, could explain about that night in the rain and the billionaire who had shown up to help. But instead, she said simply, "Because everyone deserves health care, because your father's life matters, because you shouldn't have to choose between your job and your family. That's why we exist, to make sure people like you have somewhere to turn." After the young woman left, clutching the information packet and the confirmation that her application had been submitted, Maria sat alone in the community center and cried. She cried for that young maid who reminded her so much of herself. She cried for everyone who was still struggling, still desperate, still falling through the cracks. She cried because even with all they were doing, it still wasn't enough. There were still too many people in need, too many barriers, too many systemic failures. But she also cried because of what was possible. 2 years ago, that young woman would have had nowhere to turn. Her father might have died. She might have lost her job trying to care for him. Their family might have been destroyed by medical debt and grief. But now, tonight, she had walked into a community center and found help. She had been listened to and believed and supported. Her father would get his surgery. She wouldn't have to choose between her job and his life. And maybe, just maybe, her story would have a different ending than it would have had 2 years ago. That was worth crying about. That was worth celebrating. And that was worth continuing to fight for day after day, application after application, policy fight after policy fight. Maria pulled out her phone and called Alexander. It was late, but he had told her she could call any time, and she knew he meant it. "Maria," he answered on the second ring, "is everything okay? I just helped a young woman whose father needs surgery. She's a maid, just like I was. And I realized, this is what you meant when you said one night of help could change everything. You helped my mother for one night, and now, 2 years later, I'm helping other people's mothers and fathers. The ripple effects keep spreading." "That's exactly what I hoped would happen," Alexander said quietly. "One person helping one person who then helps another person. That's how we change the world, not through grand gestures, but through consistent action and genuine care." "Thank you," Maria said. "I don't think I say that enough. Thank you for coming to my door that night. Thank you for believing I could do this work. Thank you for getting out of the way and letting me figure out how to do it right." "You don't need to thank me. You've thanked me every single day by doing this work, by helping these people, by building something that will outlast both of us. This is my thank you to you, for showing me what was possible, for pushing the foundation to be better, for never letting us forget why we do this work." After they hung up, Maria sat in the quiet community center and thought about the future. The Santos initiative would continue to grow. They were already talking about expanding to other cities, about replicating the model nationally. Other foundations were studying their approach, adapting their methods. But Maria knew the real work wasn't in expansion and replication. It was in the daily, unglamorous work of showing up, listening, helping. It was in the young maid who walked through the door tonight and walked out with hope. It was in Son breathing easy with his properly managed asthma. It was in Mrs. Park taking her arthritis medication without having to choose between that and groceries. Real change happened in these small moments, these individual connections, these acts of solidarity and support. The policy work mattered, the advocacy mattered, the systemic change mattered. But so did this. One person helping another person in the middle of an ordinary evening in a community center in a neighborhood that the wider world usually ignored. Maria locked up the center and started her walk home. The streets were quiet, the lights from apartment windows creating a pattern against the night sky. She thought about all the people behind those windows, some sleeping peacefully, some lying awake worried about medical bills or sick family members or impossible choices. She couldn't help all of them. Even with the Foundation's resources and the initiative's programs, there would always be more people who needed help than she could possibly reach. But she could help some. She could make a difference for the ones who found their way to her door. And she could keep fighting to change the system that created these impossible situations in the first place. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative, giving up, accepting that this was just how things were, deciding that individual suffering didn't matter, was unthinkable. As Maria reached her apartment building, she saw her mother waiting at the window, the way she always did until Maria was safely home. Even though Maria was 25 now, Even though she had an important job and a decent salary and the respect of community leaders and politicians, she was still her mother's daughter. Still someone whose safety mattered, whose homecoming was watched for, whose presence in the world was cherished. Maria waved up at her mother, who waved back, and then disappeared from the window to unlock the door. By the time Maria climbed the stairs to the third floor, her mother was standing in the doorway with a bowl of soup and a smile. "Long day?" her mother asked. "Good day," Maria corrected. "I helped someone tonight who reminded me of myself 2 years ago, someone who was desperate and scared and didn't know where to turn, and I was able to help her. I was able to be for her what Alexander was for us." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You're doing what we always hoped you would do, making the world a little bit better. Come, eat your soup. Tell me about this person you helped." And so Maria did, sitting at their small kitchen table, eating the soup her mother had made with love, sharing the stories of the day with someone who understood where she had come from and was proud of where she had gone. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. People were getting sick, getting well, struggling, surviving, hopping. And somewhere in that vast metropolitan landscape, a young maid was going home to her father with the news that help was available, that his surgery would be covered, that they didn't have to face this crisis alone. That young maid didn't know that 2 years ago, someone just like her had run through the rain in the middle of the night, desperate to save her mother, and had accidentally started a chain of events that would change thousands of lives. She didn't know that her own story was now part of that larger story, that the help she received tonight was made possible by someone else's midnight desperation and courage. But Maria knew, and that knowledge filled her with purpose and determination. The work would continue. The ripples would keep spreading. The change would keep happening, one person at a time, one family at a time, one desperate midnight at a time. Because in the end, that was how the world really changed. Not through grand announcements or sweeping legislation or billionaire philanthropy, though all those things could help. The world changed when one person helped another person, when one desperate midnight led to unexpected kindness, when one maid running through the rain found a billionaire willing to open his door and offer help. The world changed when everyone decided that they weren't going to accept the unacceptable anymore, that they weren't going to let people die for lack of money, that they were going to fight for a world where health and hope weren't privileges reserved for the wealthy. Maria finished her soup and hugged her mother good night. Tomorrow she would wake up and do it all again, listen to stories, process applications, advocate for change, show up for people who needed someone to show up for them. It was hard work, sometimes heartbreaking work, but it was the most meaningful work she had ever done, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. As she lay in bed that night, her last thought before sleep was a simple one: gratitude, for her mother's recovery, for Alexander's kindness, for the opportunity to transform pain into purpose, for every person who had believed in her when she didn't believe in herself, for every person she had been able to help, for every small victory and every hard-fought change. And most of all, gratitude for that desperate midnight run through the rain, the night her life had changed forever, the night she had learned that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the transformations, that sometimes a maid asking for medicine for her sick mother really could change the world. The billionaire who had appeared at midnight had offered help, but Maria had done something even more important. She had taken that help and had transformed it into a movement, had built a bridge between privilege and need that thousands of people were now crossing toward hope and healing. That was the real story. Not a fairy tale about rescue, but a true story about what happens when crisis meets courage, when resources meet need, when one person's desperate action ripples out to create lasting change. A story about how we all save each other, how we all lift each other up, how we all have the power to make the impossible possible if we just refuse to give up, refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable, refuse to let another person die alone and afraid in the darkness. Maria had run through the rain to save her mother. But in doing so, she had learned how to save herself and then how to help save others. And that journey, from desperate maid to purposeful advocate, from powerless to empowered, from invisible to indispensable, that was the real miracle of that midnight encounter. Not that a billionaire had chosen to help, though that mattered, but that a maid had chosen to run, to risk everything, to refuse to accept the unacceptable, and in running had discovered a strength and a purpose she never knew she had. That was the story Maria would carry with her always. That was the story she would share with every person who came to her for help, every young person who felt powerless, every family facing impossible choices. The story of how one desperate midnight, one billionaire's choice to help, one maid's refusal to give up, had created ripples that would keep spreading long after all of them were gone. Because in the end, that's what hope really is. The belief that our actions matter, that our choices create ripples, that one person helping another person can start a chain reaction that changes everything. And that belief, that hope, that refusal to accept that this is just how things have to be, that was the real medicine Maria had found that midnight. Not just medicine for her mother's sick body, but medicine for a sick system, for a society that had learned to accept the unacceptable, for a world that needed to be reminded that every life matters, every person deserves care, every family deserves hope. And Maria Santos, former Maid, current director of the Santos Initiative for Healthcare Equity, daughter of a seamstress who had survived because someone chose to help and someone chose to fight. She would spend the rest of her life spreading that medicine as far and as wide as she possibly could. One person at a time, one family at a time, one desperate midnight at a time, until the world finally understood what she had learned through her pain and her fear and her midnight run through the rain, that we all deserve to live, that healthcare is a right, not a privilege, and that the measure of a society is how it treats those with the least power, the least money, the least hope. That was the story. That was the truth. And that was the work that would continue long after this particular night had faded into memory. The never-ending work of healing, helping, hopping, and fighting for a world where no one ever again has to choose between medicine and food, between caring for a loved one and keeping a job, between survival and dignity. The rain had stopped falling years ago, but the ripples of that midnight run were still spreading, still creating waves of change that would continue long into the future. And Maria Santos, who had once been just a maid asking for medicine for her sick mother, had become the living proof that desperation can become purpose, that crisis can catalyze transformation, and that sometimes the darkest midnights lead to the dawns. And gratitude for that desperate midnight run through the rain, the moment when everything changed, when the impossible became possible, when a maid asking for medicine became a catalyst for transformation. She fell asleep with that thought, and for the first time in years, she dreamed not of disasters she needed to prevent, but of possibilities she might actually achieve. And for Maria Santos and her family, it was the first day of a life that might actually include a future worth hopping for. Maria opened the door,